Sold our Lake Washington house and emptied our accounts. Starting fresh with Vanessa. Enjoy figuring out how to pay rent now that you're broke. The harsh blue light cut through the darkness of my Seattle penthouse at 2:36 a.m. as I stared at my husband's text from Bali. Perhaps Richard thought I'd be asleep, or maybe the 15-hour time difference had confused his timing. Either way, his message ended with smug finality. Don't try to reach me, changing my number tomorrow. I stared at those words, my hands trembling slightly as the reality sank in. After 22 years of marriage, this was my husband's goodbye. A text message punctuated with a smiling emoji. The kind of emoji he'd send when he was particularly pleased with himself. The same one he'd used when he'd successfully negotiated the purchase of our Lake Washington property 7 years ago. My name is Eleanor Wright, and at 47, I never expected to be rebuilding my life from scratch. But I also never expected my husband, of over 2 decades, to drain our accounts and run off with his 31-year-old personal trainer while attempting to leave me financially devastated. What Richard didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that I had seen this coming months ago. As a risk assessment consultant for major insurance companies, I'd built my career on identifying vulnerabilities and implementing protective measures. And the greatest protection I had developed was the one I created when I first noticed the signs that my husband was planning to destroy our financial future. I set my phone down on the nightstand and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows of our downtown penthouse. The Seattle skyline glittered against the dark waters of Elliott Bay, the same view that had sold us on this property 5 years ago. A smart investment, Richard had called it, a backup plan for when we need to stay in the city. How ironic that his backup plan had become my only remaining home. Taking a deep breath, I organized my thoughts as I'd done countless times in my professional life. The situation was serious, but not the catastrophe Richard believed he had orchestrated. Because while he had been planning his escape for months, I had been documenting, protecting, and preparing for exactly this moment. I picked up my phone again and typed a simple response. Check your account balances. Then I powered it off, knowing what would come next. Richard and I had met during my final year of graduate school. He was a first-year medical student, brilliant and ambitious, with dreams of becoming a renowned surgeon. Life had other plans, and after a difficult residency, he'd pivoted to dermatology, eventually building a practice that catered to Seattle's tech elite and their spouses. Botox, fillers, and laser treatments had proved far more lucrative than either of us had imagined. I had supported us through those early years, taking a job at a mid-sized insurance firm and slowly working my way up to senior risk consultant. By the time Richard's practice took off, we had developed distinct financial roles. He managed our day-to-day expenses and investments, while I handled our retirement planning and real estate. It was this division of responsibilities that had allowed Richard to believe he could execute his plan without my knowledge. But it was also what had given me the first warning signs that something was wrong. Last March, I'd noticed an unusual alert from our shared credit card, a $4,700 charge at Equinox, an exclusive gym in downtown Seattle. When I'd asked Richard about it, he'd been uncharacteristically defensive. I'm finally taking care of myself, Eleanor, he'd snapped. I thought you'd be happy that I'm getting in shape instead of working myself to death. I'd let it go, but something about his reaction had felt off. Richard had never shown interest in fitness before, always claiming he was too busy with his practice. Within weeks, he was leaving early 3 mornings a week for training sessions with a personal trainer named Vanessa, a former competitive athlete who specialized in transformations for busy professionals. By early summer, those sessions had increased to 5 times weekly, and Richard had dropped nearly 35 pounds. He'd also started changing passwords on our financial accounts, claiming it was for security purposes after a colleague's identity had been stolen. You know how cautious I am about our finances, he'd said, not meeting my eyes. I'll send you the new passwords soon. But the passwords never came. Instead, Richard began making large cash withdrawals, $9,000 here, $8,500 there, always just under the $10,000 threshold that would trigger bank reporting requirements. When I'd casually mentioned these withdrawals during dinner one night, he'd claimed they were for equipment upgrades at his practice. "The suppliers give better deals for cash," he'd explained. "I'm saving us thousands in the long run." I might have believed him if I hadn't already seen the equipment invoices from his practice, paid in full through normal business channels. That night, I'd made a decision that went against every trusting principle of our marriage. I hired a private financial investigator. What I discovered was methodical and calculated. Richard had opened a separate bank account 6 months earlier. He'd been moving money in small, irregular amounts, not enough to immediately raise alarms, but substantial over time. Most concerning, he'd contacted a real estate agent about quietly listing our Lake Washington property, claiming he wanted to test the market without alerting my wife, who's unnecessarily attached to the house. The most damning evidence came when I discovered draft emails to a property management company in Bali, inquiring about long-term villa rentals for myself and my partner. The emails included questions about privacy, security, and discretion, particularly regarding financial transactions. These discoveries led me to Caroline Zhang, a family law attorney specializing in high-asset divorces and financial fraud. "Document everything," she advised during our first consultation. "And whatever you do, don't confront him yet. If he's planning what it appears he's planning, we need to establish a clear pattern of behavior." So I did exactly that. I photographed financial statements, recorded dates of unusual withdrawals, and made secure copies of all our property deeds. I hired a forensic accountant who mapped out exactly how Richard had been moving money and where it was likely headed. But the most important step I took was filing for emergency asset protection with Judge Tanya Williams, presenting the evidence of what appeared to be preparation for financial abandonment. The judge, having seen similar cases throughout her career, granted temporary freezing orders on our joint assets. Any attempt to transfer large sums would now be automatically flagged and held. All of this had been in place for 16 days when Richard's text arrived from Bali. I imagined him now, lounging in some luxury villa with Vanessa, perhaps celebrating with champagne, believing he had executed his plan flawlessly. I pictured his face when he discovered that the successful transfers he thought he'd made had been intercepted and placed in court-monitored accounts. Over the next few days, Richard would learn that his carefully orchestrated plan had critical flaws. He would discover that the woman he believed was running away with a wealthy man would instead find herself attached to someone whose accounts were now frozen, whose assets were under court protection, and whose attempt at financial abandonment had triggered legal consequences he never anticipated. This is the story of how I protected myself from betrayal, how I rebuilt when someone tried to destroy everything I had worked for, and how that devastating text message ultimately led me to a life more fulfilling than I could have imagined. Richard and I had built what many would consider an enviable life. We owned a stunning property on Lake Washington, valued at just over $3.8 million, a contemporary masterpiece of glass and cedar with 180-degree water views and private dock access. The 5-bedroom home had been featured twice in architectural magazines, not for its ostentatious luxury but for its thoughtful integration with the natural landscape. It represented not just our largest financial asset, but the culmination of years of shared dreams. The downtown Seattle penthouse where I now stood was originally purchased as a convenience for when either of us needed to work late, a practical decision that had seemed sensible at the time. At $1.6 million, it had been an investment as much as a residence, Richard had insisted. How strange that this secondary property had now become my primary sanctuary. Our portfolio extended beyond real estate. After supporting Richard through medical school and his first struggling years as a dermatologist, I had watched him build a thriving cosmetic dermatology practice catering to Seattle's tech elite. His clinic, Renewed Aesthetics, generated over $3.2 million in annual revenue. Meanwhile, my own career in risk assessment had flourished, providing us with the financial foundation that made our lifestyle possible. Between us, we earned well into the seven figures annually. We maintained investment accounts totaling nearly $4.7 million, retirement funds approaching $2.3 million, and collections of art and wine conservatively valued at around $900,000. Richard's vintage car collection, 4 vehicles he meticulously maintained and rarely drove, was worth approximately $1.2 million. Our shared financial life represented 22 years of strategic planning, careful investing, and mutual sacrifice during the early lean years. Beyond the material assets, we had what I believed was a solid marriage built on mutual respect and shared goals. We decided early on not to have children, focusing instead on our careers, travel, and philanthropy. Through the Mercer Wright Foundation, we'd established 10 years ago, we funded scholarships for underprivileged students, pursuing careers in healthcare and financial planning, a way of paying forward the opportunities we'd been given. Our social circle consisted largely of other successful couples who admired what we had built together. If Richard succeeded in his plan, I would lose not just our primary residence, but access to decades of savings, investments, and retirement funds. At 47, I would be starting over financially at an age when such a setback could be impossible to recover from. The foundation we'd created together would collapse. The scholarships we funded would end. The life I had helped build through years of hard work would evaporate overnight, but the stakes weren't merely financial. The morning after receiving Richard's text, I sat at my kitchen island with a cup of coffee gone cold, staring at our wedding photo. We'd married in a small ceremony on Orcas Island, surrounded by just 30 close friends and family members. Richard had written his own vows, promising to be my partner in all things, to build a life of purpose and meaning together. I remembered the intensity in his eyes as he'd spoken those words, the conviction in his voice. I removed my wedding ring, a platinum band with 3 small diamonds that Richard had selected because it was elegant but practical, just like you. The emotional weight of its absence felt more significant than its physical presence ever had. 22 years of marriage, nearly half my life, had ended with a text message. My phone buzzed with a notification from our banking app. Someone was attempting to access the Lake Washington house funds from an international IP address. Richard was discovering the first flaw in his plan. The freezing of our joint assets was just the beginning of the protections I'd put in place. Caroline Zhang, my attorney, had helped me execute a comprehensive strategy that went far beyond simply securing our finances. Financial abandonment isn't just about money, she'd explained during one of our initial consultations. It's about power, control, and the systematic dismantling of someone's security. What we need to do is not just protect your assets, but ensure your future. Through Caroline, I'd secured temporary exclusive rights to our Seattle penthouse. I'd documented my substantial contributions to Richard's practice during its formative years. The loans I'd taken out to help him establish his business, the nights I'd spent helping him with business plans and marketing strategies. I'd cataloged every piece of artwork, every bottle in our wine collection, every vehicle in his prized car collection, establishing provenance and contribution. Most importantly, I'd secured a temporary restraining order against any changes to our foundation's operations or funding. The students relying on those scholarships wouldn't suffer because of Richard's betrayal. What made the stakes particularly high was the calculated nature of Richard's plan. This wasn't a spontaneous decision made in the heat of passion. The forensic accountant had traced financial maneuvers going back at least 14 months, predating even the appearance of Vanessa in our lives. Richard had been methodically preparing to leave me financially devastated for over a year. The phone rang, displaying Richard's number. I let it ring 3 times, using those moments to center myself, then answered. "Eleanor, what have you done?" Richard's voice was a mixture of rage and panic, the sound of his paradise crumbling around him. "Good morning, Richard," I replied calmly. "I see you've checked the accounts." "This is my money," he shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "You had no right—" "Our money," I corrected him, "from our 22-year marriage. Money we saved together for our retirement and our foundation's future." "I'll fight this," he threatened, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I could picture him stepping away from Vanessa, trying to hide the catastrophe unfolding. "You won't get away with this." "I've already gotten away with protecting what's legally mine," I said. "Judge Williams was particularly interested in your emails to the Balinese property managers where you discussed, and I quote, 'starting fresh where my wife can't reach me.' The Lake Washington House transaction has been voided, by the way. The buyers were quite understanding when their attorney received the court order." The silence on the other end was punctuated only by Richard's ragged breathing. Then I heard a female voice in the background asking questions, growing increasingly agitated. "Is that Vanessa?" I asked. "You might want to let her know that the offshore account you set up has also been flagged, and the state tax authority has been notified about potential evasion." "You've been spying on me," Richard finally managed, his voice hollow. "No, I've been protecting myself from your calculated betrayal," I replied. "There's a difference." I heard muffled arguing on the other end, Vanessa's voice rising in both volume and pitch. Their dream of living off our mutual assets was evaporating in real time. "Richard," I continued, "the court has scheduled an emergency hearing for next Monday. You're required to attend either in person or via video conference. Your passport has been flagged, so I suggest you make arrangements to return." "Flagged? What does that mean?" The panic in his voice was palpable now. "It means that while you can leave Bali, you'll be detained for questioning when you attempt to enter any country other than the United States. The judge was concerned you might attempt to disappear with marital assets." The argument in the background was growing louder. I could make out Vanessa saying something about promises and wasting my time. "I've emailed all the court documents to you," I said. "I also copied your brother James, since he's an attorney. He called me this morning, by the way. He's disappointed." That was an understatement. James had been furious, offering to fly to Seattle immediately to help me navigate the legal proceedings. "My brother has lost his mind," he'd said. "Our parents would be ashamed." "Eleanor, wait." Richard's voice had changed now, desperation replacing anger. "We can work something out." "We will, through the proper legal channels," I replied. "I suggest you find a good attorney." "Oh, and Richard? I've notified the medical licensing board about the medications missing from your practice inventory. They'll be conducting a review." This was another discovery from the forensic investigation. Irregular inventory records at his clinic suggesting prescription medications had been diverted. Whether for personal use or some other purpose, it represented a serious potential violation of his medical license. I ended the call and turned my phone off. The reckoning had begun, but this was just the first wave. Richard would try to fight back, people like him always did. But I had truth, evidence, and the law on my side. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. I contacted our most trusted friends, a short list of people who deserved to hear about our separation directly from me, rather than through the inevitable gossip. I arranged for additional security at both properties, following Caroline's advice about potential retaliation. I canceled joint credit cards and changed passwords on personal accounts. By evening, I was exhausted, but resolute. The initial shock had given way to a strange calm. The stakes in this situation couldn't be higher: my financial security, my reputation, my emotional well-being. But for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt fully in control of my own life. My phone powered back on with multiple notifications, 17 missed calls from Richard, 5 increasingly desperate text messages, 3 voicemails, and 1 email from Vanessa. "Mrs. Wright," it began formally, I feel I should inform you that Richard misrepresented his financial situation to me. He told me the Lake Washington property was his alone, inherited from his family, and that you had already agreed to divorce terms. I never would have become involved had I known the truth. I am ending our relationship effective immediately. I poured myself a glass of the Bordeaux that Richard had always deemed too expensive to open, and looked out at the Seattle skyline. The stakes in this battle were enormous, but I had just won the first major victory. The warning signs had been there for months, perhaps even years, subtle shifts in Richard's behavior that I had initially dismissed or rationalized away. Looking back, I could trace the erosion of our marriage like a risk analyst mapping the progression of a slowly developing threat. The first noticeable change had come approximately 18 months earlier. Richard and I had maintained a tradition of Sunday morning brunches at our favorite waterfront restaurant, followed by walks along the shoreline regardless of Seattle's often temperamental weather. These outings had been sacred time for us, opportunities to reconnect after our busy professional weeks. Then suddenly, Richard began canceling, claiming emergency patient consultations or last-minute administrative crises at the clinic. "The business is expanding," he'd explained when I expressed disappointment. "Success requires sacrifice, Eleanor. You know that better than anyone." I had known that, of course. We had both made countless sacrifices over the years to build our careers. So I accepted his explanation, adjusting to our new normal of parallel lives occasionally intersecting rather than intertwining. When I suggested we schedule a vacation to reconnect, Richard had deflected, talking vaguely about next year and when things settle down. Our intimate life had changed as well. Physical affection, once natural and frequent between us, had become increasingly rare. Richard often claimed exhaustion, falling asleep watching financial news or working late in his home office. When we did connect physically, it felt mechanical, a perfunctory fulfillment of marital obligation rather than an expression of genuine desire or love. "It's just stress," he'd said when I tried to discuss it. "The practice is demanding everything from me right now." Then came the changes in his personal habits. Richard had always been meticulous about his appearance. It came with the territory in aesthetic medicine. But suddenly his concern with his physique intensified dramatically. He began scrutinizing himself in mirrors, ordering designer clothes in smaller sizes, and experimenting with hairstyles more appropriate for men 15 years his junior. My patients expect their doctor to exemplify the aesthetic standards I promote, he'd explained while examining his profile in our bathroom mirror. "It's part of the brand now." I had actually been pleased when he first mentioned working with a personal trainer. Richard's family had a history of cardiac issues, and I'd gently encouraged him for years to prioritize exercise. What had surprised me was the intensity and secrecy surrounding these sessions. "Vanessa believes in total transformation," he'd said, showing unusual animation. "She says most people fail because they're not fully committed to the process." The $4,700 Equinox charge that had first alerted me was for a premium training package, 50 sessions paid in advance, something entirely out of character for Richard, who typically insisted on monthly billing for even our most routine expenses to maintain payment flexibility. Within weeks, he had transformed our spare bedroom into a home gym filled with specialized equipment. His eating habits changed dramatically, with specific meal preparations that he insisted on handling himself. He began taking an assortment of supplements that arrived in unmarked packages. "Proprietary formulations," he'd said dismissively when I inquired. "Cutting-edge nutritional science that hasn't hit the mainstream yet." More troubling than these physical changes were the shifts in how Richard related to our shared history. He began rewriting the narrative of our life together, subtly at first, then more overtly as the months progressed. During a dinner with friends, I'd mentioned the lean years when my income had supported us both through his medical training. "You're remembering that wrong," Richard had interrupted, smiling indulgently at our guests. "I was always financially independent." I had those research grants, remember? Those research grants had covered barely a quarter of his expenses, and we both knew it. But Richard's revisionist account continued throughout the evening, painting himself as the primary architect of our success while minimizing my contributions. Later that night, when I'd questioned this strange reframing of our history, he'd accused me of being obsessed with keeping score and unable to let go of the past. The financial red flags began appearing against this backdrop of personal estrangement. First came the password changes, then the unexplained withdrawals, then the secretive phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered a room. Richard had always been private about certain aspects of his practice. Patient confidentiality, he'd explained, but now entire portions of his life became off-limits for discussion. His schedule grew increasingly erratic, with last-minute trips for medical conferences that couldn't be found in any official program listings when I later checked. There was the matter of the safe deposit box. We had maintained one for years, containing important documents and family heirlooms. During a routine visit to update our wills, I discovered Richard had opened a second box in his name only. When confronted, he'd claimed it contained sensitive patient records that couldn't legally be stored at the clinic. "It's a compliance issue," he'd explained vaguely. "Nothing for you to worry about." I might have continued overlooking these warning signs had it not been for an unexpected encounter last spring. While attending a fundraising gala alone, Richard had canceled at the last minute due to patient complications. I overheard a conversation between two women I didn't recognize. "She's taking him for everything," one woman had said, sipping champagne. "Total transformation inside and out. By the time Vanessa finishes with these men, they're unrecognizable to their wives." "That's her specialty," the other woman replied. "She finds them when they're having their midlife crises, convinces them they need a complete reinvention, and then helps them transition to their authentic lives, which conveniently always includes leaving their wives." I'd moved closer, pretending to admire a nearby sculpture. "Richard is her biggest challenge yet," the first woman continued. "All that money tied up in joint assets. But Vanessa says he's completely committed to the plan. Another few months of liquidating and transferring, and they'll be ready for the big escape." My blood had run cold. There could be multiple men named Richard in Seattle planning exits from their marriages, but the specific mention of joint assets and liquidation matched too perfectly with the anomalies I'd been noticing. The next day, I'd taken my first concrete step toward protection. I contacted my college roommate Melissa, now a private investigator specializing in financial cases. I had framed it initially as a hypothetical situation, but Melissa had seen through that immediately. "Eleanor," she'd said gently, "this doesn't sound hypothetical. If what you're describing is happening, you need to act quickly. Men who plan." Financial abandonments have usually been preparing longer than their wives realize. With Melissa's guidance, I began documenting everything. I created a secure digital vault containing photographs of financial statements, property records, and unusual bank transactions. I recorded dates and times of suspicious activities, noting Richard's explanations in precise detail. I also began researching Vanessa Kimura more thoroughly. Her professional credentials were legitimate, degrees in exercise physiology and nutrition, certifications from respected fitness organizations, but her client list revealed a troubling pattern. Over the past 5 years, she had worked exclusively with wealthy married men between the ages of 45 and 60. In at least 3 cases, these men had divorced their wives shortly after beginning their transformations, each time amid allegations of hidden assets and financial misconduct. One afternoon, while Richard was supposedly at a medical conference in Portland, I had visited his clinic unannounced, using the owner access he had never thought to revoke. His office manager, Charlotte, who had been with Richard since he started his practice, had seemed uncomfortable with my presence. "Dr. Wright isn't here today," she'd said, standing protectively near his office door. "I know," I'd replied calmly. He's at the dermatology conference in Portland. I just needed to pick up some papers from his office for our accountant. Charlotte's expression had flickered briefly with confusion. Portland? But he's at the retreat with Ms. Kimura. They left yesterday for... She had stopped abruptly, realizing her mistake. After an uncomfortable silence, her professional loyalty to Richard had visibly wavered. Eleanor, she'd said quietly, I've worked with both of you for 15 years. I can't say much, but you should look at the practice financial records, specifically the equipment purchase accounts. That tip had led to one of the most significant discoveries in my investigation. Richard had been using the practice's equipment budget to funnel money into a separate account, disguising the transfers as purchases from a vendor that existed only on paper. Over $340,000 had moved through this channel in the previous year, alone. Another crucial piece of evidence had come from an unexpected source. Richard's brother James had called me with concerns after a strangely emotional conversation with Richard. He was asking about foreign banking laws, James had explained, specifically about Indonesia's policies on financial privacy and extradition. When I asked why he needed this information, he said it was for a patient considering expatriation for tax purposes. But Eleanor, he was asking very specific questions about how marital assets are treated. James, an international tax attorney, had found the conversation disturbing enough to reach out to me directly. I've never interfered in your marriage, he'd said, but something doesn't feel right about this. All these indicators had painted a clear picture of what was coming. But the final confirmation had arrived in the form of an email sent to me by mistake. Richard had apparently intended to forward property listings in Bali to Vanessa, but in his haste had selected my name from his contacts instead. The email thread included their previous exchanges, with Richard writing, "Once the transfers are complete and the divorce papers are filed, we'll have approximately 7.2 hours liquid to start our new life. Eleanor will never know what hit her until now it's too late." That email had been the catalyst for my meeting with Caroline Zhang, the specialist in high-asset divorces and financial fraud. Caroline had reviewed my evidence and immediately recognized the pattern. "This is methodical financial abandonment," she'd confirmed, "and based on the timeline you've documented, we need to act quickly. Washington is a community property state, which works in your favor, but only if we can prevent him from moving those assets beyond the court's reach." Within days, we had prepared the emergency filings for asset protection and judicial oversight. Judge Williams, after reviewing the substantial evidence I'd collected, had granted the protective orders with unusual speed. "The court takes a dim view of attempted financial abandonment," she'd noted during our hearing. "Ms. Wright's documentation presents clear and convincing evidence of an orchestrated plan to deprive her of lawful marital assets." All these pieces had been in place when Richard's text arrived from Bali. His message, intended to devastate me with the news that I was suddenly homeless and penniless, had instead activated the legal safeguards I'd carefully arranged. What Richard could never understand was that his betrayal hadn't caught me by surprise. The signs had been there all along, written in changes large and small, in revised histories and secretive behaviors. My professional life had trained me to recognize patterns of risk and implement protective measures. Richard had simply never considered that I would apply those same skills to protecting myself from him. The morning after my confrontation with Richard, I woke before dawn and followed a routine I'd established during particularly challenging periods of my career. 30 minutes of meditation, a 3-mile run along the waterfront, and a carefully prepared breakfast eaten mindfully, without digital distractions. These practices had carried me through corporate mergers, industry downturns, and professional setbacks. Now they would help me navigate the dissolution of my marriage. To understand how I was able to protect myself from Richard's betrayal, you need to understand the foundation of who I am and the experiences that shaped me long before I met him. I grew up in a modest household in Eugene, Oregon, the only child of a high school mathematics teacher and a bookkeeper. My parents had married later in life and had me in their early 40s, bringing to their parenting a sense of perspective and deliberate choice rather than youthful impulsiveness. From my earliest years, they emphasized self-reliance and critical thinking. Always have your own resources, my mother would tell me. Always be able to stand on your own 2 feet. This wasn't just abstract advice. It was lived experience. My mother had witnessed her own mother struggle after an unexpected divorce in an era when women had few financial protections. That generational trauma had shaped her approach to life and, consequently, her guidance to me. My father contributed equally important lessons. A mathematician by training and temperament, he approached problems methodically, breaking them down into manageable components. When something seems overwhelming, he would say, divide it into parts. Solve what you can solve today, then move to the next piece tomorrow. This analytical mindset became my natural approach to challenges. While other children might have been praised primarily for outcomes, I was praised for my process, for careful observation, logical thinking, and systematic problem solving. Financial literacy was treated as a core subject in our home, as fundamental as reading or mathematics. By 12, I was managing my own savings account and simple investment portfolio. By 16, I was reading corporate annual reports for companies I was interested in, analyzing their risk disclosures with my father's guidance. This background led naturally to my choice of risk assessment as a career. After completing my MBA with a focus on actuarial science, I joined a mid-sized insurance firm where I quickly distinguished myself by developing more comprehensive risk evaluation models. My particular talent lay in identifying subtle patterns that others missed, the small inconsistencies or anomalies that often signaled larger underlying problems. Within 7 years, I had advanced to senior risk consultant, specializing in high-value asset protection for corporate clients. My work involved anticipating potential threats to organizational stability and developing proactive safeguards. I became known for my ability to detect vulnerabilities before they could be exploited, often reviewing complex systems and immediately identifying their weakest points. This professional training became an integral part of my personality and perspective. I didn't just apply these skills at work. They became my lens for viewing the world. I maintained emergency funds, comprehensive insurance coverage, and detailed contingency plans as a matter of course. These weren't responses to anxiety, but expressions of prudent foresight. Colleagues sometimes teased me about my methodical approach to everything from vacation planning to kitchen organization. Eleanor's Plan B always has its own Plan B became something of a running joke at the office. I accepted this gentle ribbing with good humor, confident in the value of my thoroughness. When I met Richard during my final year of graduate school, he had initially been drawn to these very qualities. As a medical student facing the daunting path to becoming a physician, he had appreciated my stability and organizational skills. "You make everything seem manageable," he had told me during our early dating days. "You break down these impossible mountains into little molehills that anyone could climb." Our courtship had been relatively brief, 10 months from first meeting to engagement. Richard had presented himself as equally thoughtful and methodical, a man who approached his medical training with the same analytical rigor that I brought to my financial work. We had seemed perfectly matched, two logical, ambitious professionals who valued stability and careful planning. The early years of our marriage had confirmed this compatibility. We functioned as a team, supporting each other's career development while building our financial foundation brick by careful brick. Richard's focus had narrowed considerably during his medical residency, requiring me to manage most aspects of our daily life and long-term planning. But this had seemed a natural division of labor given his grueling schedule. When Richard decided to pivot from his original plan of becoming a general surgeon to specializing in dermatology, I had fully supported the transition. I had researched the financial implications, created projections for clinic establishment costs, and developed a 5-year plan to build his practice while maintaining our financial security. "I couldn't do this without you," Richard had said when we signed the lease on his first small office space. "Your planning makes everything possible." As his practice grew, I had continued applying my professional skills to our personal life. I had created comprehensive insurance coverage that protected both our assets and Richard's medical practice. I had established estate planning documents that ensured continuity, regardless of what might happen to either of us. I had maintained detailed records of all major purchases, investments, and property improvements. These habits, developed long before I had any reason to distrust Richard, ultimately became my salvation when that trust was broken. There was another aspect of my character that proved crucial: my emotional self-regulation. Growing up with older parents who valued composure and rational discourse, I had learned early to process feelings methodically rather than react impulsively. This wasn't emotional suppression, but rather disciplined expression, acknowledging feelings fully while not allowing them to dictate actions. During particularly stressful periods at work, I had developed specific techniques for maintaining clarity under pressure. Deep breathing exercises, journaling, and strategic breaks for perspective had become second nature. When faced with Richard's betrayal, these same practices allowed me to separate the emotional devastation from the practical requirements of the situation. The night after discovering Richard's accidental email about his plans, I had allowed myself a carefully bounded period of emotional release. 2 hours of private grief and anger, complete with tears and verbal expressions of rage. Then I had deliberately shifted to analytical mode, beginning the documentation process that would ultimately protect me. This ability to compartmentalize, to experience emotions fully while not being controlled by them, had been essential to implementing my protection strategy without alerting Richard. During the weeks when I was quietly gathering evidence and consulting attorneys, I had maintained outward normalcy in our interactions, preventing him from realizing I had discovered his plans. My professional network had been another crucial resource. Years of building relationships with attorneys, financial advisors, and other risk assessment professionals had given me immediate access to specialized expertise when I needed it most. I hadn't had to search blindly for help or rely on generic advice. I had reached out directly to respected colleagues who understood the nuances of my situation. Caroline Zhang, the attorney who guided me through the asset protection process, had been a contact from a professional women's leadership group I'd joined a decade earlier. The forensic accountant who tracked Richard's financial maneuvers had previously consulted on a corporate case I had managed. Even Judge Williams, who granted the emergency orders, had once spoken at a risk management conference I had attended. These professional connections had provided not just practical assistance, but also emotional reinforcement. They had validated my concerns, confirmed my observations, and reminded me of my own competence when self-doubt threatened to emerge. "I've seen this pattern before," Caroline had told me during our initial consultation. "Your documentation is more thorough than most clients manage in these situations. Your professional background is serving you well." That validation had been profoundly steadying during a time when Richard's gaslighting might otherwise have made me question my own perceptions. Another aspect of my character that proved essential was my capacity for long-term strategic thinking. Throughout my career, I had specialized in scenarios that extended 5, 10, even 20 years into the future, analyzing how current decisions would create cascading effects over time. This ability to think several moves ahead like a chess player had allowed me to anticipate Richard's likely actions and prepare appropriate countermeasures. For example, when I realized Richard might attempt to manipulate colleagues or friends with his version of events, I had preemptively reached out to our most trusted connections, providing them with limited but accurate information. This wasn't about creating allies in a divorce battle, but about ensuring that key people in our lives understood the basic facts before Richard could establish a false narrative. This strategic foresight had extended to professional considerations as well. Recognizing that divorce proceedings might temporarily consume significant emotional and mental energy, I had proactively reorganized my client commitments, delegating certain responsibilities to trusted team members while maintaining direct oversight of critical projects. This had preserved my professional reputation during a potentially destabilizing personal crisis. Perhaps most fundamentally, I possessed a clear-eyed recognition of my own worth, not just professionally, but as a human being deserving of honesty and respect. Despite the psychological impact of Richard's betrayal, I had maintained a core certainty that I deserved better than his treatment and had both the right and the capacity to protect myself from harm. This self-valuation wasn't pride or entitlement, but a grounded self-knowledge that rejected Richard's implicit message that I could be discarded without consequences after decades of partnership. It was this deep self-respect that had propelled me to take protective action rather than collapse under the weight of betrayal. "You're handling this with remarkable composure," Melissa had commented during one of our evidence-gathering sessions. "Most people in your situation would be emotionally paralyzed." "I'm certainly feeling everything," I had replied. "But I've always believed that respecting yourself means protecting yourself when necessary. My emotions and my actions can run on parallel tracks." This combination of characteristics, analytical thinking, emotional self-regulation, professional networking, strategic foresight, and fundamental self-respect, formed the foundation that allowed me to respond effectively to Richard's betrayal. These weren't qualities I developed in response to crisis, but capacities I had built throughout my life, long before I had any reason to deploy them defensively. The text from Bali that Richard intended as my destruction had instead activated the full spectrum of my capabilities. In attempting to exploit what he perceived as vulnerability, he had inadvertently triggered the strongest aspects of my character, the very qualities that would ultimately ensure not just my protection, but my transformation and growth beyond the marriage he was discarding. The accidentally forwarded email from Richard to Vanessa sat open on my laptop screen, its implications rippling through me like seismic waves. "Eleanor will never know what hit her until it's too late," he had written, discussing the $7.2 million they planned to abscond with after liquidating our assets. For exactly 3 minutes, I allowed myself to experience the full force of the emotional tsunami. Betrayal, rage, grief, fear. I watched the second hand on my office wall clock complete 3 full revolutions, giving myself this strictly bounded period to feel everything without restraint. Then, with a deep breath, I closed the email and opened a new document. I titled, "It Response Protocol," a clinical phrase that helped me maintain the necessary emotional distance. My fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, outlining the steps I would need to take. The initial list was simple. Document everything. Consult specialized legal counsel. Secure copies of all financial records. Establish baseline of marital assets. Identify vulnerable accounts, car properties. Develop protection strategy within an hour. I had expanded this framework into a comprehensive action plan with timelines, contingencies, and resource requirements. By evening, I had implemented the first critical steps. My initial response focused on documentation rather than confrontation. Before Richard returned from his claimed medical conference, which I now knew was actually a weekend with Vanessa, I had photographed relevant financial statements, created backup copies of tax returns for the past 7 years, and secured digital copies of all property records. I worked systematically through our shared office, documenting the contents of file cabinets and desk drawers. I photographed Richard's handwritten notes about account transfers. I backed up emails related to our finances. I created an inventory of significant assets with approximate valuations. This process was emotionally excruciating. Each document represented another facet of our shared life, another memory now tainted by betrayal. But the methodical work, provided a focus that prevented emotional paralysis. The familiar rhythm of documentation, a process I had performed countless times in my professional life, became almost meditative. By Sunday evening, when Richard returned home, I had assembled a comprehensive digital archive of our financial life together. This information was secured in multiple locations: encrypted cloud storage, a password-protected external drive kept in my office, and copies sent to my private email account that Richard had no access to. "How was the conference?" I asked him that evening, maintaining the facade of normalcy. "Productive," he replied vaguely, not meeting my eyes. "Some interesting new techniques in facial rejuvenation." I nodded, sipping my tea, noting how easily the lies came to him now. I'm glad it was worthwhile. That night, as Richard slept beside me, I lay awake planning my next steps. Direct confrontation would alert him to my knowledge and potentially accelerate his plans. Instead, I needed expert guidance from someone familiar with cases like mine. The following morning, I contacted Melissa Thompson, my former college roommate who had become a private investigator specializing in financial cases. We met for coffee at a small cafe far from my usual haunts, where I laid out the situation with the precise detail of a risk assessment report. Melissa listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly grave. When I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand, a rare display of emotion from someone as professionally composed as myself. "I've seen this pattern before," she said, "but I've rarely seen someone in your position recognize it so clearly and respond so strategically. You've done exactly the right thing so far." "What should my next steps be?" I asked. "You need specialized legal counsel immediately," she replied. "Not just any divorce attorney, but someone who specializes in high-asset cases involving financial concealment." Before we parted, Melissa provided 3 recommendations. At the top of her list was Caroline Zhang, described as relentless in protecting clients from financial abandonment. I scheduled a consultation with Caroline for the following day, taking the unusual step of clearing my afternoon calendar by delegating a client meeting to my associate. The potential professional risk was outweighed by the urgent need for legal guidance. Caroline's office occupied the 28th floor of a downtown Seattle high-rise, with views of Elliott Bay that rivaled those from my penthouse. Her reputation had prepared me for someone formidable, but I was struck by her calm, almost gentle, demeanor as she reviewed the documentation I had assembled. "Most clients come to me with suspicions but little concrete evidence," she said, looking up from my organized files. "You've already completed what would typically be our first 3 weeks of work together." Her assessment of my situation was direct but not alarmist. Based on the evidence I had gathered, Richard was engaged in what legal professionals termed financial abandonment, the systematic concealment and removal of marital assets in preparation for divorce. His actions, while morally reprehensible, followed a pattern Caroline had seen numerous times throughout her career. "Washington's community property laws offer you significant protection," she explained, "but only if we can prevent assets from disappearing beyond the court's reach. Based on what you've shown me, we need to move quickly but strategically." Together, we developed a 3-pronged approach. First, we would prepare emergency court filings for temporary orders freezing joint assets. This would require presenting evidence of Richard's intent to remove marital property, which my documentation provided. Second, we would employ a forensic accountant to trace the movement of funds and identify any accounts or investments I might not be aware of. Third, we would document Richard's pattern of deception without alerting him to our actions, creating a record that would strengthen our position when the matter eventually came before a judge. "What about confronting him?" I asked. "Part of me wants to walk into his office right now and tell him I know everything." Caroline shook her head firmly. "That's exactly what we don't want to do. The moment he knows you've discovered his plan, He'll accelerate his timeline and potentially take more desperate measures. Our advantage right now is that he believes you're completely unaware. I nodded, recognizing the wisdom in her advice even as I struggled with the emotional burden of maintaining a facade of normalcy. How do I continue living with him, pretending everything is fine, when I know what he's planning? I asked. You're already a skilled risk assessment professional, Caroline replied. Think of this as the most important risk management case of your career. Compartmentalize, observe, document, protect. I left Caroline's office with a clear action plan and a renewed sense of resolve. That evening, I began implementing the next phase of our strategy: subtle monitoring of Richard's activities without raising suspicion. I installed specialized software on our home network that would alert me to any unusual financial transactions conducted on our shared internet connection. I placed a discreet voice-activated recorder in Richard's home office. I set up notifications for all credit cards and bank accounts to track activity in real time. These measures might seem extreme in a normal marriage, but I had moved beyond any illusions about the relationship Richard and I now had. This wasn't a partnership. It was a battlefield where my financial future and self-respect were under attack. The most challenging aspect of this period was maintaining normal interactions with Richard. Each morning, we would exchange pleasantries over breakfast as though nothing had changed. Each evening, we would discuss mundane household matters with the practiced ease of a long-married couple. I might need to go to Los Angeles next month for a medical equipment expo, he mentioned casually one evening. Probably a 3-day trip. That sounds worthwhile, I replied, knowing from my monitoring that he had actually been researching property in Indonesia during his equipment research sessions. This dual reality, the public performance of a functioning marriage alongside my private knowledge of his betrayal, created a peculiar psychological state that I navigated by focusing intently on the protection strategy we were implementing. 2 weeks after my initial consultation with Caroline, we were ready to file for emergency court orders. Our documentation was comprehensive, presenting clear evidence of Richard's intent to remove marital assets without my knowledge or consent. The filing included Richard's emails discussing starting fresh where Eleanor can't reach me, bank records, showing systematic withdrawals just under reporting thresholds, and documentation of his attempts to quietly list our Lake Washington property through a real estate agent who had been told I was unnecessarily attached to the house. Perhaps most damning was the timeline we had constructed, demonstrating the methodical nature of his preparations over many months. This wasn't an impulsive decision, but a calculated strategy to leave me financially devastated while he began a new life with Vanessa. I took a personal day to attend the emergency hearing before Judge Tanya Williams, a respected jurist known for her no-nonsense approach to family law matters. Caroline had prepared me for the possibility that the judge might grant only partial protections or request additional evidence before issuing comprehensive orders. To my relief, Judge Williams reviewed our filings with evident concern, asking pointed questions that indicated she grasped the urgency of the situation. These patterns of financial behavior are deeply troubling, she noted, reviewing the documentation. The court takes a very dim view of attempts to circumvent equitable distribution through concealment or removal of marital assets. By the end of the hearing, Judge Williams had granted comprehensive temporary orders that exceeded even Caroline's optimistic projections. All joint accounts were frozen, with withdrawals limited to documented ordinary living expenses. Richard was prohibited from selling, transferring, or encumbering any property acquired during the marriage without court approval. Both of us were required to provide full financial disclosures within 15 days, including all accounts, investments, and property interests. A court-appointed financial guardian would review any transaction over $5,000 from any account connected to either of us. Richard's passport was flagged in the system, requiring him to notify the court of any international travel plans. Most significantly, attempted violations of these orders would be considered contempt of court, potentially triggering immediate financial penalties. As we left the courtroom, Caroline squeezed my arm gently. "This is the strongest protection order I've seen Judge Williams issue in 5 years of practicing before her," she said quietly. "Your documentation made all the difference." I nodded, feeling a complex mixture of vindication and sorrow. The legal victory was unquestionably important, but it also represented the irrevocable end of my marriage, not just in my private knowledge, but now in public record. "What happens next?" I asked as we waited for the elevator. "Now we wait," Caroline replied. "Richard will discover these orders the moment he attempts any significant financial transaction. When that happens, we'll see his true colors very clearly. The protections were in place, the documentation secured, the legal groundwork established." My initial response to Richard's betrayal had transformed from emotional shock to strategic action. Now, all that remained was to see how he would react when he discovered that his carefully constructed plan had been dismantled before he could complete it. I returned to the penthouse that evening, knowing that somewhere between here and Bali, a text message awaited that would change everything, not in the way Richard intended, but in the way I had meticulously prepared for. The days following the court order were surreal in their mundane normality. I continued my work routine, attended meetings, and maintained surface-level conversations with Richard during our increasingly rare moments together at home. He remained oblivious to the legal fortress I had constructed around our assets, still confident in the infallibility of his escape plan. Richard announced his trip to Bali with the casual air of someone mentioning a routine business obligation. "I need to attend an international dermatology symposium," he explained over dinner 3 weeks after the court orders had been granted. "It's in Bali this year. I'll be gone for about 10 days. "Bali sounds lovely this time of year," I replied, taking a sip of water to maintain my composure. "When do you leave?" "Next Tuesday," he said, already scrolling through his phone, apparently relieved that I hadn't questioned the sudden international trip. I nodded, noting how he avoided eye contact, a pattern that had become increasingly common in our interactions. "I hope the symposium is productive." As Richard packed for his symposium, I observed the unusual selections that filled his luggage, far more clothing than a 10-day professional conference would require, including casual resort wear that would never appear at a medical convention. Most telling was the small box I discovered in his toiletry bag when he stepped out to take a call. It contained the diamond cufflinks he had inherited from his father, along with his grandfather's vintage watch, portable valuables easily converted to cash. I said nothing, simply documenting these observations in the detailed journal I had been maintaining since discovering his plans. That journal had become both a pragmatic record for legal purposes and a therapeutic outlet, allowing me to process my emotions without compromising the strategic facade I maintained. The morning Richard left for Bali, I drove him to the airport. The normality of this routine act, something I had done dozens of times throughout our marriage, created a surreal dissonance, knowing it would be the last time I performed this particular marital ritual. "Have a good flight," I said as he gathered his luggage outside the terminal. Richard hesitated momentarily, and for a brief instant, I wondered if some remnant of conscience might be surfacing, if he might reconsider the devastating blow he planned to deliver. But he simply nodded, leaned in for a perfunctory kiss on my cheek, and turned toward the departures entrance without looking back. I watched him disappear into the terminal, a stranger wearing the face of the man I had loved for over 2 decades. As I drove home, I contacted Caroline to confirm that Richard had indeed departed. Our plan was now fully in motion, awaiting only his inevitable attempt to access the frozen assets. For the next several days, I maintained my normal routine while monitoring our accounts closely. Richard made no immediate financial moves, likely waiting until he was settled in Bali before initiating the massive transfers he had planned. I imagined him and Vanessa enjoying their tropical paradise, blissfully unaware of the financial fortress. that now surrounded what they believed would be their escape funds. On the fifth day after Richard's departure, the moment arrived. At 10:23 a.m. Seattle time, 1:23 a.m. in Bali, I received an automated alert. Richard had attempted to transfer $2.3 million from our joint investment account to an offshore entity registered in the Cayman Islands. The transaction had been automatically blocked per the court order, generating immediate notifications to me, Caroline, and the court-appointed financial guardian. Within minutes, a second alert indicated another attempted transfer, this time trying to move $1.8 million from our retirement accounts. This, too, was blocked. Over the next 30 minutes, 5 more attempted transfers appeared, each blocked automatically, each generating additional documentation of Richard's attempts to violate the court order. I imagined his growing frustration and panic as transaction after transaction failed, his perfect escape plan crumbling with each denied transfer. The monitoring system showed him making multiple calls to various financial institutions, attempting to override the blocks by claiming technical errors or authorization issues. Caroline called me as the sequence of failed transactions unfolded. "He's walking right into it," she said, her voice reflecting professional satisfaction rather than personal vindication. "Each of these attempts strengthens our position dramatically." "How long until he figures it out?" I asked. "Financial institutions won't tell him about the court order directly. They'll just say the transactions can't be processed and direct him to contact the account holder. My guess is he'll try every account you have before he realizes something systemic is blocking him." Caroline's prediction proved accurate. By mid-afternoon, Richard had attempted to access nearly every financial account we held, encountering the same frustrating blockage with each effort. Finally, at 4:17 p.m., my phone lit up with his name. I had prepared for this moment, rehearsing what I would say, how I would maintain my composure. I let the phone ring several times, using those moments to center myself, then answered with a calm, "Hello, Richard." "Eleanor, something's wrong with our accounts," he began, his voice tightly controlled despite obvious tension. "None of the transfers are going through. I need you to call the bank and sort it out immediately." "I'm aware of the situation with the accounts," I replied evenly. A moment of silence followed as my response registered. "What do you mean you're aware? Did you do something?" The pretense of casual inquiry was slipping, revealing the edge of panic beneath. "The accounts are under temporary court protection, Richard, as are all our marital assets." The silence that followed was profound, the sound of a carefully constructed plan collapsing into ruin. When he finally spoke, all pretense had vanished. "What the hell have you done?" he demanded, his voice rising with each word. "I've protected what's legally mine," I replied, maintaining the calm tone that I knew would frustrate him more than anger would. "Our assets are under court supervision pending divorce proceedings." "You can't do this," he insisted, desperation creeping into his voice. "You have no right." "I have every right," I interrupted, my voice firm but not emotional. "Judge Williams was particularly interested in your emails about starting fresh where Eleanor can't reach me, and your plans to leave me financially devastated." The sharp intake of breath on the other end confirmed that my reference to his specific words had landed with precision. In that moment, Richard realized I hadn't just discovered his general intention, but had accessed the detailed planning he thought was completely secure. "You've been spying on me," he accused, attempting to shift the moral high ground. "No, Richard. I've been protecting myself from your calculated betrayal. There's a difference." In the background, I could hear a female voice, Vanessa presumably, asking increasingly urgent questions as their paradise began crumbling around them. "The Lake Washington House transaction has been voided, by the way," I continued. "The Kai buyers were quite understanding when their attorney received the court order." "You had no right to interfere with that sale," Richard snapped, abandoning any pretense that the transaction had been legitimate. Actually, I had every legal right. The property is jointly owned, and Washington state law requires both spouses' consent for the sale of community property. The argument in the background was growing louder. I could make out Vanessa's voice demanding to know what was happening. "Richard," I continued, "the court has scheduled an emergency hearing for Monday morning regarding your violation of the temporary orders. You're required to attend either in person or via video conference. Your attempts to transfer assets despite the court order will be reviewed." "I'm in Bali," he protested weakly. "I can't just— The court is aware of your location. Arrangements have been made for remote participation. I should mention that your passport has been flagged, so I suggest you make arrangements to return to the United States directly." "Flagged? What does that mean?" The panic in his voice was palpable now. "It means that while you can leave Bali, you'll be detained for questioning if you attempt to enter any country other than the United States. The judge was concerned you might attempt to disappear with marital assets." The muffled argument in the background intensified. I heard Vanessa's voice rise sharply, words like "promised" and "millions" clearly audible even through Richard's attempt to cover the phone. "I've emailed all the court documents to you," I said. "I also copied your brother James, since he's an attorney. He called me this morning after reviewing everything. He's disappointed." That was an understatement. James had been appalled, apologizing repeatedly for his brother's behavior and offering any assistance I might need in the proceedings. "This isn't over, Eleanor," Richard said, his voice hardening as he realized the extent of his exposure. "You've just made everything far more complicated than it needed to be." "On the contrary, Richard, I've simplified things considerably. The court now has a clear record of your intentions and actions. That tends to streamline legal proceedings significantly." As our conversation ended, I felt a curious sense of calm wash over me. For months, I had been living in a state of hypervigilance, maintaining a facade of normalcy while secretly preparing for this moment. Now that it had arrived, now that the confrontation I had anticipated was finally occurring, I felt an unexpected sense of relief. The turning point wasn't just Richard's discovery that his plan had failed. It was my recognition that in protecting myself from his betrayal, I had reclaimed a sense of agency that transcended our marriage. The woman he had attempted to leave destitute had instead orchestrated a comprehensive counter-strategy that had preserved not just her financial security, but her dignity. In the days that followed, Richard's reaction unfolded in predictable stages. First came rage, a series of increasingly hostile messages demanding that I remove the financial restrictions immediately. When that proved ineffective, he pivoted to bargaining, suggesting various compromises that invariably favored his interests while offering minimal concessions. "We could split everything 60-40, he proposed in one late-night call. "You keep the penthouse, I take the Lake Washington house. No need for attorneys or courts to be involved." "The court is already involved, Richard," I reminded him calmly. "And Washington is a community property state. The standard division is 50-50 for assets acquired during marriage." When bargaining failed, he attempted intimidation, threatening prolonged legal battles and publicly humiliating revelations if I didn't cooperate with his demands. Caroline had prepared me for this phase, assuring me that such threats typically represented desperation rather than genuine legal strategy. "Men like Richard rely on intimidation because they've run out of legitimate options," she explained. "Hold your ground. His attorney, assuming he's competent, will eventually make Richard understand his position." The most revealing moment in this turning point came not from Richard but from Vanessa. 3 days after the initial confrontation, I received an email from her, formal, carefully worded, and clearly crafted to establish distance from Richard's actions. "Mrs. Wright, I feel I should inform you that Richard misrepresented his financial situation to me completely. He told me the Lake Washington property was his alone, inherited from his family, and that you had already agreed to divorce terms. I never would have become involved had I known the truth about his deceptions and financial manipulations. I am ending our relationship effective immediately and returning to Seattle separately. I forwarded the email to Caroline without comment. It was neither surprising nor particularly meaningful to me personally. Vanessa's abandonment of Richard once his financial promises proved hollow seemed a fitting consequence of their shared deception. What mattered more was the fundamental shift that had occurred in the balance of power. Richard had left for Bali believing he was executing a masterstroke that would secure his new life while leaving me shattered. Instead, he found himself isolated, legally exposed, and facing consequences that would permanently alter his professional and personal standing. For me, this turning point represented more than a tactical victory in divorce proceedings. It marked the moment when I fully recognized that the skills, judgment, and resilience I had cultivated throughout my life had prepared me for this unexpected challenge. The protection strategy I had implemented wasn't just about preserving financial assets. It was about affirming my own worth and agency in the face of profound betrayal. As I prepared for the upcoming court hearing, I understood that what had initially seemed like an ending, the devastating conclusion of a 22-year marriage, had become something else entirely. The beginning of a chapter I would write myself, on my own terms. The emergency court. Hearing scheduled for Monday morning arrived with an air of inevitability. Following Richard's multiple attempted violations of the temporary orders, Caroline had advised that our focus should shift from protection to resolution. It was time to move beyond defense into a comprehensive strategy for the divorce proceedings. Richard's actions have given us significant leverage, she explained during our preparation session the day before the hearing. But we need to be strategic about how we use it. Our goal isn't punishment, it's securing your future. I nodded, appreciating her perspective. Despite the pain and betrayal, I had no interest in a vindictive approach that would prolong the legal battle and drain resources on both sides. What I wanted was a fair division of our marital assets, appropriate accountability for Richard's deceptive actions, and the most efficient path to rebuilding my life. What's our objective for tomorrow's hearing? I asked. 3 things, Caroline replied, laying out the documents before us. First, we want the judge to maintain the temporary orders with even stricter monitoring given Richard's violation attempts. Second, we'll request an expedited financial discovery process to account for all assets. And third, we'll propose a settlement framework that would allow for reasonable resolution without protracted litigation. This balanced approach, firm on protection but open to reasonable settlement, aligned perfectly with my values. Throughout my career, I had learned that even in adversarial situations, finding pragmatic resolution often served all parties better than scorched earth tactics. The hearing itself, conducted via video conference to accommodate Richard's location in Bali, proceeded with the clinical efficiency characteristic of Judge Williams's courtroom. Richard appeared on screen from what appeared to be a luxury villa, accompanied by Jeffrey Palmer, a high-profile divorce attorney known for representing wealthy clients in contentious proceedings. I sat beside Caroline in the courtroom, my posture straight, expression composed, hands folded calmly on the polished wood table. I had deliberately chosen my attire, a tailored navy suit that projected professionalism rather than victimhood. This wasn't about appearing sympathetic, it was about being recognized as a competent equal party in these proceedings. Judge Williams began by reviewing the documented evidence of Richard's multiple attempts to transfer assets despite the court's orders. As each instance was cataloged, 7 separate attempts totaling over $8.3 million. I watched Richard's expression on the video screen grow increasingly tense. These actions represent clear and deliberate violations of this court's explicit orders, Judge Williams noted, her tone measured but firm. Dr. Wright, do you wish to provide any explanation for these attempts? Richard glanced at his attorney, who leaned in to whisper something before speaking. Your Honor, there was a misunderstanding regarding the scope of the orders. Dr. Wright believed that certain personal accounts were excluded from the restrictions. Judge Williams' raised eyebrow conveyed her skepticism more effectively than words could have. And this misunderstanding led to 7 separate transfer attempts from 7 different accounts over a period of several hours. There was confusion, Richard began, but Judge Williams cut him off. The court finds that explanation lacks credibility given the systematic nature of the attempts and the offshore destinations of the intended transfers. She turned to address Caroline. Counsel, what remedy do you propose regarding these violations? Caroline rose, her manner respectful but confident. Your Honor, we request enhanced monitoring of all financial accounts associated with Dr. Wright, with weekly reporting requirements to the court-appointed financial guardian. Additionally, we ask the court to require Dr. Wright to return to the jurisdiction within 7 days to ensure proper participation in these proceedings. Judge Williams considered this for a moment before nodding. The court concurs with those remedies. Additionally, given the clear attempt to violate prior orders, the court will require Dr. Wright to post a compliance bond of $500,000 to ensure adherence to all future orders in this case. Richard's face flushed visibly on the video screen. The compliance bond, essentially a financial penalty held in escrow that would be forfeit if he violated further orders, represented both a significant immediate expense and a public recognition of his misconduct. As the hearing progressed to addressing the expedited discovery process, I maintained my composed demeanor while observing the subtle dynamics between Richard and his attorney. Palmer appeared increasingly frustrated with his client, particularly when Judge Williams directed pointed questions about Richard's offshore accounts that had been uncovered by our forensic accountant. These accounts in Singapore and the Cayman Islands were not disclosed in your initial financial statement, Dr. Wright, Judge Williams noted. Can you explain this omission? Richard shifted uncomfortably before responding. Those are business investment accounts related to potential international expansion of my practice. I didn't consider them marital assets. Washington is a community property state, Dr. Wright, Judge Williams reminded him. All assets acquired during marriage, regardless of how they're titled, are presumed community property unless specifically demonstrated otherwise. Your counsel should have advised you of this fundamental principle. By the time we reached the discussion of our proposed settlement framework, Richard's confidence had visibly eroded. The methodical dismantling of his position, not through emotional arguments but through systematic presentation of evidence and applicable law, had revealed the fundamental weakness of his stance. Caroline presented our settlement approach with the precision of a master strategist. Rather than making extreme demands that would trigger defensive rejection, she outlined a framework based on established legal principles: equal division of community property, recognition of separate property with proper documentation, and reasonable maintenance provisions given the length of the marriage and our respective earning capacities. Ms. Wright is prepared to engage in good faith settlement discussions along these guidelines, Caroline concluded. Our objective is fair and efficient. Resolution, not punitive measures. This reasonable approach accomplished exactly what we had intended. It positioned me as the rational actor seeking appropriate resolution, while highlighting Richard's deceptive actions without resorting to emotional accusations. Judge Williams appeared to appreciate this approach. The court encourages the parties to pursue settlement discussions along the framework outlined. However, given the documented history in this case, all negotiations will be conducted with full financial transparency and oversight by the court-appointed guardian. As the hearing concluded, Judge Williams issued her formal ruling. The emergency orders would remain in place with enhanced monitoring. Richard was required to return to Seattle within 7 days. Comprehensive financial discovery would proceed on an expedited schedule, and settlement discussions would be scheduled following completion of discovery. Outside the courtroom, Caroline squeezed my arm gently. That went exactly as we hoped. Judge Williams clearly sees through Richard's explanations, and his attorney knows it. What happens next? I asked as we gathered our documents. Richard will return to Seattle, probably furious, but increasingly aware of his vulnerability. His attorney will begin pushing him toward settlement once he reviews all the evidence we've assembled. The compliance bond was a significant win. It puts immediate financial pressure on Richard while signaling the court's view of his conduct. Caroline's prediction proved accurate. Richard returned to Seattle 5 days later, not to our shared homes, but to a luxury hotel downtown. His attorney requested a meeting with Caroline within 48 hours of his return, a clear indication that Palmer was advocating for settlement rather than protracted litigation. While these legal proceedings advanced, I implemented the personal elements of my strategic response. I contacted the board members of our foundation, explaining the situation transparently and proposing a restructuring that would ensure its mission continued regardless of my marital status. I met with my financial advisor to begin planning for my post-divorce financial future, with particular attention to retirement security and investment diversification. Most importantly, I began reimagining my living arrangements. The Lake Washington house, though beautiful, held too many memories of a life built on what I now recognized had been an increasingly hollow partnership. The downtown penthouse, originally purchased as a convenience property, now felt more genuinely mine, a space where I could envision building my independent future. Working with my interior designer, Sophia, I began subtle but meaningful changes to the penthouse's aesthetic, replacing artwork Richard had selected with pieces that reflected my own tastes, rearranging furniture to create a more personalized flow, and converting Richard's home office into a combination library and meditation space. This isn't just redecorating, Sophia observed as we reviewed fabric samples. This is reclaiming. She was right. Each change, however small, represented a step toward creating a home that expressed my identity rather than accommodating a partnership that no longer existed. The process was both practical and deeply symbolic, a physical manifestation of the internal transformation I was experiencing. Parallel to these personal changes, I maintained rigorous professionalism in all aspects of the divorce proceedings. When our forensic accountant discovered additional undisclosed accounts containing nearly $1.2 million in assets Richard had hidden, I instructed Caroline to address this discovery through formal legal channels rather than confrontational accusations. Document, report, proceed became our mantra. A methodical approach that consistently yielded better results than emotional reactions would have. This strategic discipline proved especially valuable when Richard made his inevitable attempt at narrative control. 3 weeks after returning to Seattle, he began contacting mutual friends and colleagues, presenting himself as the victim of an overzealous legal response to what he characterized as a temporary marital rough patch. Rather than engaging in competing narratives or public rebuttals, I maintained dignified silence, allowing the court records, which were public documents, to speak for themselves. When friends reached out, clearly having heard Richard's version of events, I responded simply, "This is a painful personal matter that I prefer not to discuss in detail. I'm focused on moving forward constructively." This restraint required significant emotional discipline, but aligned with my long-term strategy. Public battles over reputation would only deplete my energy and distract from the substantive issues that needed resolution. The people whose opinions truly mattered to me would recognize the inconsistency between Richard's claims and his documented actions. One such person was his brother James, who contacted me approximately 1 month after the emergency hearing. We met for coffee at a quiet cafe near my office, where he expressed his continuing dismay at Richard's behavior. "I've reviewed all the court filings," he said, his expression grim. "I scarcely recognize my own brother in these actions. The level of calculation, the willingness to leave you financially devastated after 22 years." He shook his head. "Our parents raised us better than this." "I'm not looking to turn you against your brother, James," I assured him. "Family Relationships are complicated, and they persist beyond divorce. I appreciate that, he replied. But integrity matters to me, Eleanor. Richard's conduct in this situation violates basic principles of honesty and responsibility. I've told him directly that I cannot support or justify what he's done. James's moral clarity was touching, but I was careful not to enlist him as an ally against his brother. Maintaining ethical boundaries, even in adversarial situations, had always been central to my professional approach, and I applied the same standard to this personal challenge. As the discovery process neared completion, Richard's attorney requested a formal settlement conference, a clear indication that he was advising his client to resolve the matter rather than proceed to trial. Caroline viewed this as validation of our strategic approach. Richard's attorney recognizes that the evidence overwhelmingly undermines any position other than an equitable division, she explained. The documented attempts at financial abandonment have critically weakened Richard's negotiating position. The settlement conference was scheduled for 6 weeks later, providing time for complete financial disclosure and preliminary negotiation of key issues. During this period, I maintained my focus on systematic preparation rather than emotional reaction, working with financial advisors to develop clear objectives for the settlement discussions. My strategy throughout this challenging period centered on 3 core principles: protection of my legitimate interests, efficient resolution without unnecessary conflict, and foundation building for my future beyond the marriage. By maintaining this focus, even when Richard's actions triggered understandable anger or hurt, I consistently made decisions that served my long-term well-being rather than short-term emotional satisfaction. This wasn't about winning in the conventional sense of inflicting maximum damage on Richard. It was about ensuring that his attempt to leave me financially devastated did not succeed, while creating the conditions for my own thriving in the next chapter of my life. As the date for our settlement conference approached, I maintained the careful equilibrium I had established, proceeding methodically with divorce preparations while continuing my professional responsibilities and personal recalibration. What I hadn't anticipated was Richard's desperate escalation when he realized that conventional legal maneuvers would not allow him to preserve the advantages he had attempted to secure through deception. The first sign of this new phase came when Charlotte, the office manager from Richard's dermatology practice, contacted me through a personal email rather than her work account. "Eleanor, I need to speak with you urgently, but not over the phone or email. Can we meet somewhere private?" When the request was unusual enough to warrant caution, I suggested a meeting at my attorney's office, where our conversation would be protected by legal privilege. Charlotte agreed immediately, suggesting she wanted whatever she shared to be documented properly. When we met the following afternoon, Charlotte's typically polished professional appearance was marred by visible stress. After declining coffee with shaking hands, she got directly to the point. "Richard asked me to alter the practice's financial records," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, despite the privacy of Caroline's conference room. "He wants me to backdate equipment purchases and vendor payments to justify the missing funds that your financial investigator discovered." Caroline, who was sitting in on the meeting at my request, leaned forward slightly. "He explicitly asked you to falsify business records?" Charlotte nodded, pulling a small digital recorder from her purse. "I recorded our conversation. Washington is a 2-party consent state for recording, so this wouldn't be admissible in court, but I needed protection in case he tried to claim I had acted independently." She pressed play, and Richard's voice filled the room, instructing Charlotte to create a paper trail for equipment that had never been purchased and services never rendered. The conversation clearly documented his intent to submit fraudulent financial information to the court. "He doesn't know I'm here," Charlotte continued after stopping the recording. "I've worked for Richard for 15 years. I've always been loyal, but this crosses a line I won't cross. He's asking me to commit potential felony fraud." Caroline exchanged a glance with me before addressing Charlotte. Your integrity in this situation is commendable. Would you be willing to provide a sworn statement regarding this conversation? We wouldn't use it unless absolutely necessary, but it would create a significant deterrent if Richard continues down this path. Charlotte agreed, though her hands trembled slightly as she signed the notarized statement Caroline's assistant prepared. Before leaving, she hesitated at the door. There's something else you should know, she said quietly. Richard has been removing patient medications from the practice inventory for months, prescription-grade dermal fillers, Botox, and other controlled substances. I don't know if they're for personal use or other purposes, but the inventory discrepancies are substantial. This information was disturbing on multiple levels: potential violations of medical ethics, controlled substance regulations, and possibly criminal statutes. Caroline advised that while relevant to Richard's general credibility, we should address this information carefully to avoid appearing vindictive. We'll notify the appropriate regulatory authorities anonymously, she suggested. This protects public safety concerns without appearing to use it as divorce leverage. I agreed with this approach, recognizing that while Richard's professional misconduct might indirectly strengthen my position in divorce proceedings, mixing these issues could complicate both matters. The professional violations needed to be addressed through proper channels, independent of our marital dissolution. Richard's next escalation came from an unexpected direction. 2 days after Charlotte's visit, I received an email from the executive director of our foundation, Meredith Collins, requesting an urgent meeting regarding troubling financial directives. When we met at the foundation's offices the following morning, Meredith explained that Richard had contacted her directly, instructing her to transfer $1.4 million from the foundation's endowment to a special project fund he would personally oversee. He insisted it was with your full knowledge and approval, Meredith explained, showing me the emails. But the request violated our governance procedures, and something felt off about the urgency. The foundation's assets had not been included in the court's freezing orders because they were legally separate from our personal finances, a distinction Richard had apparently identified as a potential loophole. His attempt to divert these charitable funds represented not just a new financial attack, but a willingness to compromise a philanthropic mission we had built over years. Working with the foundation's legal counsel, we implemented immediate protective measures, removing Richard's access to foundation accounts, requiring dual authorization for all significant transactions, and documenting the attempted diversion for both the foundation's board and the court overseeing our divorce. These incidents highlighted a troubling pattern. As Richard's standard legal options narrowed, his tactics became increasingly desperate and ethically questionable. This escalation created new challenges requiring vigilance on multiple fronts simultaneously. The most personal challenge emerged when Richard began attempting to leverage our social connections. Several mutual friends contacted me, concerned about Richard's claims that I was experiencing mental health episodes triggered by irrational suspicions. He had apparently suggested to several people that my legal actions were symptoms of paranoia rather than responses to his documented deception. This particular tactic was calculated to undermine my credibility and generate sympathy for him, a form of gaslighting extended to our social circle. The strategy was especially painful because it weaponized the trust and goodwill of people who cared about both of us. Rather than engaging in character defense or counter-accusations, I chose a measured response. I met individually with our closest friends, acknowledged the painful situation without providing unnecessary details, and suggested that court records were available for anyone truly concerned about the factual basis of our proceedings. This is obviously a difficult time, I told my friend Diane over coffee. I understand Richard is sharing his perspective, and I respect your friendship with both of us. I'm focused on resolving this situation with integrity and moving forward, not on winning a public relations campaign. This approach was emotionally taxing, but strategically sound. The friends who mattered most recognized the inconsistency between Richard's claims and his documented actions, while those who accepted his narrative without question revealed themselves as connections I could comfortably release from my life. The most aggressive challenge came approximately 2 weeks before our scheduled settlement conference. Richard's attorney filed an emergency motion alleging that I had systematically alienated Richard from our social circle and interfered with his medical practice through defamatory statements. The motion requested sanctions against me and a reconsideration of the temporary orders, arguing that my conduct had created unnecessary hardship for Richard. The filing included declarations from 3 of Richard's colleagues and 2 social acquaintances attesting to my supposed campaign against him. Caroline was livid when the motion was served. "This is textbook projection," she fumed as we reviewed the allegations. "He's accusing you of exactly what he attempted to do to you." The legal response required intensive preparation, gathering evidence to refute each specific allegation while maintaining the professional tone that had characterized our approach throughout the proceedings. We collected sworn statements from mutual acquaintances confirming I had never made disparaging statements about Richard. We documented my careful separation of the divorce proceedings from Richard's professional concerns. We prepared a comprehensive timeline demonstrating that any reputation damage Richard had experienced stemmed directly from his own documented actions. The hearing on Richard's motion became the most emotionally challenging court appearance of the entire process. Sitting in the courtroom while Richard's attorney characterized me as vindictive and calculating required every ounce of self-control I had cultivated. The irony of being accused of the very behavior Richard had exhibited was both painful and infuriating. When my turn to testify arrived, I maintained the composed demeanor that had served me throughout the proceedings, addressing each allegation with factual responses rather than emotional reactions. When Richard's attorney attempted to provoke an angry response through increasingly confrontational questions, I returned consistently to documented facts and chronology. "Ms. Wright," he demanded during cross-examination, "isn't it true that you've systematically worked to destroy my client's medical practice out of vindictiveness?" "No," I replied calmly. "I have taken appropriate legal steps to protect marital assets while the court determines equitable distribution. I have made no public statements regarding Dr. Wright's practice and have instructed my attorney to address his professional regulatory issues separately from our divorce proceedings." Judge Williams, who had presided over all our previous hearings, appeared increasingly skeptical of Richard's claims as the evidence unfolded. When his attorney attempted to introduce a new declaration from a casual acquaintance at the last minute, the judge's patience visibly thinned. "Counsel, the court has allowed significant latitude in this emergency motion, despite questionable substantiation," she noted. "However, introducing undisclosed declarations during the hearing itself violates basic procedural requirements." Get dirty. Her ruling, Judge Williams not only denied Richard's motion in its entirety, but also ordered his attorney to pay a portion of my legal fees associated with responding to what she termed allegations without reasonable evidentiary support. This judicial rebuke represented a significant blow to Richard's already weakened position. As we left the courtroom, Caroline squeezed my arm gently. "That couldn't have gone better for us," she said quietly. "Judge Williams clearly sees the dynamic here. Richard just substantially damaged his credibility for the settlement conference. The intensity of these challenges, from attempted financial manipulation to social undermining to legal harassment, created a pressure that tested my resilience on multiple levels simultaneously. Each new attack required energy to address, while continuing to manage my professional responsibilities and personal well-being. During this period, I developed additional self-care practices to sustain my equilibrium. I began working with Dr. Samira Patel, a psychologist specializing in high-conflict divorce situations, who helped me recognize that Richard's escalating tactics represented desperation rather than strength. The more control he loses, the more extreme his efforts to regain it will become, she explained during one session. This isn't about you personally anymore. It's about his inability to accept that his actions have consequences he can't manipulate away. This perspective helped me maintain emotional distance from Richard's provocations, viewing them as tactical maneuvers rather than personal assaults. Dr. Patel also introduced specific mindfulness techniques to help me decompress from the constant vigilance these challenges required. I expanded my support network beyond those who knew both Richard and me, connecting with a small group of women who had navigated similar situations. Our monthly dinners became spaces where I could speak freely about the experience without concern for divided loyalties or judgment, a form of communal wisdom that provided both practical advice and emotional validation. Most importantly, I maintained absolute clarity about my ultimate objectives: fair resolution of the marriage dissolution, protection of my financial security, preservation of my professional reputation, and creation of a foundation for my future. Beyond this challenging period, this clarity helped me evaluate each new challenge according to its actual threat to these goals rather than its emotional impact. The cumulative effect of Richard's escalating tactics was significant, requiring constant attention, generating legal expenses, and creating emotional strain that affected my sleep and concentration. Yet each challenge also reinforced my conviction that I had made the right decision in protecting myself from someone willing to employ such methods. By the time our settlement conference finally arrived, Richard's desperate maneuvers had actually strengthened my position considerably. His attempts to circumvent court orders, manipulate foundation assets, and damage my reputation through false allegations had created a documented pattern of behavior that significantly undermined his credibility with the court. What he had intended as tactics to pressure me into concessions had instead become evidence that reinforced the necessity of the protections I had secured. The challenges had intensified, but my response to them had ultimately made resolution more likely on terms that truly reflected equity rather than exploitation. The settlement conference concluded with terms that validated my protective actions. I received the penthouse, half of all financial assets, and full control of our foundation. Richard's medical license was suspended following the investigation into missing medications. 1 year later, I stood before a room of women at a financial empowerment workshop I'd created. Preparation isn't paranoia, I told them. It's self-protection everyone deserves. In the audience sat 3 women who had contacted me after hearing my story. Each had taken steps to protect themselves from similar situations. Sometimes the text meant to destroy you becomes the catalyst for your greatest strength.